I I assume we're live, so it's 9:30, um, and it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce my longtime colleague and friend Nancy C. Brady of the Lifespan Institute and the Department of Speech, Language, and Hearing at the University of Kansas. Nancy is a professor and chair in SPLH and an investigator in the LSI at the University of Kansas. Her research has long been about understanding how pre-speech communication develops, identifying aspects of pre-speech communication and its relationship to language development, and most appropriate to our theme for this year's Gatlinburg Conference, to developing interventions aimed at promoting language by strengthening those foundational skills. Nancy is a certified speech-language pathologist, and her research informs clinical practice, particularly for individuals with severe autism, Down syndrome, Fragile X, and other rare disorders associated with IDD. Her research program has been enormously successful, and as she's published over 75 peer-reviewed journal articles, plus various books, book chapters, and probably thousands of conference presentations. Most importantly, she's one of a rare breed of investigators whose work transcends particular disciplines. Her work has been supported by the National Institutes of Health, U.S. Department of Education, and by Autism Speak. So she's garnered support from a wide range of constituencies. Her work contributes to the development of future clinicians and scholars, and through classroom teaching, mentorship, and active participation in development activities. I'm pleased and honored to introduce her today and introduce her talk on successes and challenges in treating severe communication disorders. Nancy, thanks so much for agreeing to do this, and thank you very much, and we'll be sitting here enjoying your talk.
Thanks. Thanks very much, John. It's my privilege to be here. So I want to start with some acknowledgments. And as John mentioned, some of the funding agencies that have supported my research, so I want to acknowledge and thank each of them very much. And also all of my many colleagues at the University of Kansas, including postdocs and former students. I started to list everybody, and it was a very long list, and I got very nervous I would leave important people out. So please know that I appreciate each and every one of you. The families and teachers who we have worked with, who are paramount to the success of any line of research and interventions. And lastly, this conference, the Gatlinburg Conference, which has really been my professional home base, and where I have met so many fascinating individuals who have shaped my line of research. And I'm so happy to have a little role in moving it forward. Okay, so as I was preparing for this talk, I was also preparing for the course I teach this semester, which is a course on treating communication disorders in students who have a significant impairment associated with IDD alone or in combination with other factors like sensory limitations. And these are all students learning to be speech-language pathologists. So at the start of this semester, I hadn't actually taught it for a couple years, so I sent out a survey and asked, what is it that you want to learn? What do you hope to get out of this course? So I could kind of try to tailor it a little bit. And their answers were similar to feedback that I've had in past semesters. They wanted to know what to expect and how to plan for students who have particular diagnoses. Basically, the idea is that if we know someone's diagnosis, we can surmise their communication phenotype and then assess in particular areas of suspected weakness and apply treatments that have been proven to be effective for students with that diagnosis. And it's not just students who seek to understand communication and language from a diagnosis point of view. Many of our funding mechanisms that support our research are specific to a diagnostic group. And often this is because there's a lack of information about the language or communication for that particular group, and there's a need to know. Also, parents are often effective advocates in obtaining additional research pertaining to a particular disorder. And I also remember having, as a beginning clinician, having these same driving forces. I remember actually one of my first students on my caseload was a student with Landau-Kleffner syndrome. And I thought to myself, I can't believe after spending all this time and money in this in my training program, nobody taught me specifically how to treat a child with Landau-Kleffner syndrome. So I had to go look it up and kind of figure it out. Next semester, I had a student with periventricular leukemyalgia. So you get the idea that many specific diagnoses come before us, and it can be kind of difficult to figure out what to do with each individual. So when I looked at how I actually assessed and treated and thought about it across individuals with different diagnoses, I actually found more similarities than specific differences that might be associated with those diagnoses. So on reflection, I'd say about 40% of goals and objectives were relevant to developmental attainments or developmental theory, and about 40% reflected unmet needs or our functional goals. Sometimes that was complementary, sometimes not as complementary to developmental theory, and maybe about 20% reflected specific phenotypic characteristics. This is unscientific, just within the brain of Nancy Brady. So this balance between developmental perspectives, functional outcomes, and phenotype really still characterizes my research on assessments and interventions for individuals who have minimal verbal skills associated with conditions such as autism or IDD. So several years ago, a group of us started using the term minimally verbal to describe individuals who communicate mostly without speech or other forms of communication past, say, the age of 3. Personally, I like the term because many of the individuals I see in research and practice do have some speech or use some symbolic form of communication, such as sign or graphic mode communication, but they aren't proficient. In fact, if they're really proficient, then I'm not really interested in them. What I'm really interested in and focused on is how to help people who haven't yet acquired a symbolic form of communication system to be better communicators. And this is my burning question. So specifically, my research has focused on communication with pre-linguistic behaviors, such as gestures, eye gaze, vocalizations, and idiosyncratic speech and idiosyncratic movements used to communicate. Now, there are a lot of people that we can describe as minimally verbal or having minimally verbal skills. If we just consider folks with autism, recent estimates are that up to a third of individuals could be described as minimally verbal up till kindergarten or later. So that's a big chunk of the population. And I am going to show you a couple of videotapes to illustrate the kind of folks that I've been talking about and will continue to talk about for the rest of this plenary talk. So this is a young man with autism, and he's interacting with Kristen Muller, who is a former doc student of mine who's now at Baylor, and I'm sure she is has been partying all night and day. But go Baylor. Anyway, so they are participating in this assessment where we want to see if he'll communicate about a fan that goes off. So it's a joint attention type of task. And you'll see that he is very interested in it, and he lets her know that he sees it, and he really comments about it, but without spoken words. So great joint attention, nice eye gaze, and he touches her, and I think he actually kind of has a crush on her. So nice job, Jeffrey, communicating prelinguistically. So another example from a young woman in a task where we bring out a bubble machine, which sometimes works, sometimes doesn't, and the bubbles start to go, and you'll see that she really likes it, and she lets, again, Kristen know that she likes the bubbles with a lot of great affect, gestures, and vocalizations.
Hey, Nancy, I'm going to interrupt you real quick. Can you share this through is this on PowerPoint? Okay, can you share it through the PowerPoint or go ahead and reshare it and then click share audio and video?
Okay, do what?
So stop sharing and then click the share screen again. And then there should be a share audio button at the bottom left.
Share audio. I have my audio, but I have share screen, YouTube video, or Miro.
Okay, so, click share screen.
Okay.
And then did you just do your entire screen or the PowerPoint?
The entire screen.
Okay, do the entire screen, and in the bottom left, there's a share audio. Click that button. Perfect.
Okay.
All right, sorry about that, guys.
Yep, thank you. There's a reason they put me here first. You know, I'm the guinea pig, but I'm happy to do it. Okay, so the last one, it didn't have actually a lot of vocalizations, but I'll go ahead and show this one again since she does have some nice vocalizations too.
Here we go. Woo! Look at all those. I can pop them. Oh, I popped a big one. There are so many. Yeah. I think I popped the last one. Yeah. We can do it again.
Okay, so lots of cool ways to communicate prelinguistically, and just a couple of examples to share with you to get started of who I mean by people that could be described as minimally verbal. Now, my interest in minimally verbal goes way back. I mean way back, like late 80s, early 90s, where I started working on a communication program project with Jim and Lee McLean at the Parsons Research Center. I'm the bubble on the right, just in case you don't know me. So first we described that as part of this research, we described the types of communication that we observed in individuals who at that time were described as having severe to profound mental retardation. And we invoked much of the developmental findings from seminal researchers like Liz Bates and Jerome Bruner, who had talked about prelinguistic behavior in infants, and then we used that information to describe the communication we were seeing, not in infants, but actually in adults living in institutions. And this was actually quite radical at the time. I remember one site visit where we actually sent a research assistant down to Parsons, which was 2.5 hours away because the site visit was on the main campus. And we asked them to bring back videotapes of individuals communicating, sort of similar to what I just showed you. Probably not quite as good of quality. And because this particular site visitor didn't believe that this type of communication actually existed in older individuals. So we were able to show the communication with gestures, vocalizations, and eye gaze. And further in this research, we described differences in the forms and functions of communication. So people who communicated only with a contact gesture, such as directly touching somebody or an object, and designated with the C on these bar graphs were limited to communicating for requests or protests, here described as proto-imperatives, whereas individuals who also pointed or used other forms of distal communication, these are the individuals with Ds on the bar graph, were also able to comment or make, and actually each of the examples in the videotapes earlier would be examples of commenting types of functions. So communicating beyond just asking for things. So pointing was a real difference. And those of you who work with individuals with autism this probably sounds familiar, since lack of pointing is a red flag for having autism, but it's also a sign of individuals who have more significant or severe forms of developmental disability or intellectual disabilities. So just based on that basic finding, are there some treatment implications for these basic descriptions of prelinguistic communication? Yes, I think there are, and both from developmental and from functional perspectives. So developmentally, if someone is observed to not yet be producing any intentional communication acts, that is, they don't gesture towards or vocalize towards another person for some assumed meaning, then a first step might be to teach contact gestures that occur more often, even in those with the most limited communication. Susan Bashinsky and I took this approach when we were working with young deaf-blind children who also had IDD. We were able to show that increases in the use of communication we were able to show increases in the rates of communication gestures, as you can see in the table. And these communication gestures lay the groundwork for more sophisticated gestures like pointing and symbolic communication like sign. They are also highly functional communication in and of themselves. If any of you have had the opportunity lately to interact with a young child and that child approached you and gave you an object, I bet that you were able to interpret this act as communicating either a need for help in activating the object, or maybe they just wanted to share something about the object, but you understood that it was communication and it was obvious and nobody had to teach it to you. So I would like to see more interventions directly teaching gestures and gestures accompanied by vocalizations in the early phases of communication interventions, or as part of an ongoing intervention approach. We know from research by Gross-Lewis and others that for young children, communication acts that are comprised of vocalizations, eye gaze, and gestures are responded to most often and responded to with input by other individuals. So these forms of communication can also act to recruit input that is essential for learning more symbolic forms of communication in addition to using these forms in themselves. So, would it be helpful to first ensure a robust communication system without symbols before targeting speech or other symbolic means? Maybe, but it would be extremely difficult to experimentally demonstrate this, right? You'd have to have some children learn non-symbolic communication first, then another group of children go straight into symbolic interventions and do some kind of comparison. And for a lot of really good reasons, that line of research would never really fly. But instead, people have looked at relationship between these prelinguistic behaviors and later language outcomes through some sophisticated modeling procedures and longitudinal studies. So we've looked at what predicts outcomes for early language interventions. And by me, I mean the field. So there's been a lot of studies, and I just picked a few exemplary ones for this slide. So the question is, do children who start out with higher rates of non-symbolic communication do better, both in terms of like maybe interventions or just progress longitudinally better without a specific intervention? So the answer is yes. So we know that children who communicate more non-symbolically do better in some of the best interventions available. and in longitudinal studies that aren't focused on a particular intervention. So why don't we actually target these skills? That's sort of a rhetorical question. So when I returned to Kansas in the early 2000s, I participated in a longitudinal clinical trial with my colleagues Mark Fay, Steve Warren, Shelley Braden-Oja, Liza Feinstack, and Paul Yoder, where we examined the effects of prelinguistic milieu teaching on language outcomes. In an early publication from that trial, we found that those who participated in our experimental intervention showed significant increases in rates of communication, mostly non-symbolic communication rates. Now, I was really excited about this, and it made sense because the intervention really emphasized teaching prelinguistic communication. And then although we modeled speech and we reinforced the heck out of any spoken words that we heard from the children, we really didn't see a main effect for speech language outcomes. And in a later publication, even when the intensity was upped, main effects for language outcomes were hard to come by. It turns out that it can be really difficult to find main effects for spoken communication for children who have not learned to talk yet by the ages of 4 or 5. So what about augmentative or alternative communication, or AAC systems, such as sign language or graphic symbols with or without voice output? Are these forms of communication are often easier to teach, they're easier to physically prompt, sometimes easier to model, and maybe easier for some children to learn. Turns out that symbols are difficult to learn for many children, whether they are spoken symbols or whether they are other forms of symbols too. So, but we have tackled this problem in a number of ways. So many of us have tried to figure out what are the keys to symbolic communication that could facilitate teaching and learning. So symbols are abstract representations of things or events that we learn to use to communicate about objects that aren't present and to communicate concepts such as emotions, affirmations, and ideas to others who are familiar with that same symbolic system. So they're really important. All of the prelinguistic communication behavior that I've been talking about and saying is so important won't accomplish these goals. So they're much more limited. And even though I've been talking about the importance of pre-symbolic, I recognize that we need to get symbolic for as many people as we can. Okay, so part of this research, in consultation with colleagues Marianne Romsky and Rose Sevchik, we investigated lexicograms as a possible symbolic form, but learning an abstract symbolic system is still difficult for many children, no matter the form. So how do typical kids master this feat? Many of you are likely aware of researcher Deb Roy's TED Talk about the birth of a word. If you haven't, you should definitely check it out. It's really fascinating. But and what was really kind of the epitome of a Big Brother experiment, Roy put cameras all over his house and documented all of the occurrences leading up to his child's learning of his first word or first series of words. He documented every moment of his young child's environment, and they analyzed 90,000 minutes of home interactions leading up to his child learning to say the word water. So they, not surprisingly, they found that he said the word water around the faucet, around the bathtub, and there's a really nice demonstration of the morphing of the sound ga into water over, again, these 90,000 minutes that they analyzed. So pretty cool. And there's something about the word water, right? So as you likely also remember, the other cinematic moment occurring that documented the aha moment when Helen Keller also learned the meaning of words happened around water. And this sparked a generation of teachers and later speech language pathologists. That aha moment, in fact, I still can't watch that scene without crying. I don't think I ever will. Anyway, that aha moment followed countless hours of hard work by Helen Keller's teacher, Anne Sullivan. And also, Helen Keller was a brilliant young child, and she already had an existing functional communication system, although it was not socially acceptable. So those are all really important underlying premises. But one lesson from both the Roy MIT research and the Helen Keller story is the importance of input. So when we teach someone to use AAC and other symbol systems, often they are provided minimal examples of using signs or symbols throughout the day. I've met families that say they are teaching their child sign language, for example, and I would comment something about, oh, wow, you must be a fluent signer. You must have going to classes and you're signing with them all the time. That's awesome. And often I get a confused look like, no, we're just doing a few signs and hoping that they pick it up. If you think about it, there's no way for someone to learn a symbol system unless they are massively exposed to that system, which is something that I think that we've failed to do with a lot, not all, but with a lot of AAC interventions. And it's difficult to do this in terms of in a research study. If you think about most of us can't invest the type of time and intensity that Anne Sullivan provided to Helen Keller in ongoing research studies. So this is definitely one of our challenges. In a study in 2010, we followed the interactions of preschool children with minimal verbal skills, 30 preschool children with minimal verbal skills in their preschool classrooms. And we followed them and we documented every time the child initiated any communication, every time the adult responded, and then vice versa between the adults initiating and the child responding. So note that the children had very low initiation rates in their everyday interactions in their preschool, about 1 every 10 minutes, a little bit more than that. So not a high rate of initiation going on. And then, but we did find significant correlations between child initiations and adult responses, suggesting that providing consistent responsive input is related to child initiations. In our longitudinal study of families that have a child with Fragile X syndrome, we also found that the highest trajectories of vocabulary learning were for children who had highly responsive mothers. So that would be the top trajectory in this graph. And the outcome measure is rate of different words over time. So again, responsive input is one of those key ingredients that's important to provide in interventions. So to summarize to this point, I would say that we know a lot about effective interventions to increase communication, and that we've demonstrated that increasing communication will lead to increased input by caregivers and others in their environment. And we have many demonstrations that input is key, but either we haven't provided enough input because it's very difficult to do so, or there are other missing key ingredients in helping some children learn to communicate with speech, sign, or other symbolic means. As the pandemic hit, right? That could be the whole phrase for the last year, as the pandemic hit. But we were in the midst of a randomized clinical trial as the research project associated with the Kansas IDD-RC. And we were investigating a multimodal intervention for children with minimal verbal skills and autism between the ages of 5 and 10. So to kind of bridge from the last section, really trying to figure out some key ingredients that we might bring together to help kids who have not been successful in learning symbolic communication to learn specifically spoken communication and AAC. So in this intervention, we select a set of words based on the sounds that a child is making in their non-speech vocalizations. And the sounds are derived from Lena recordings, which many of you are familiar with. The child wears the Lena recording, in our case, over 2 consecutive school days. And then we find the periods of time when the child is vocalizing the most. And then one of our research assistants transcribes all the sounds that the child makes. It's a way to get a phonemic inventory from a child who will not sit and do a regular or tick test with you. So then from those sounds, we comprise consonant, vowel, consonant words. And the idea being that children should learn to say words made up of sounds that they're already saying in their non-speech vocalizations, easier than if we picked words that were made up of sounds that they couldn't already produce. The intervention is multi-component. Again, trying to bring in everything I knew clinically to try to come up with an intervention that I thought would have some impact in getting kids off a baseline for word productions. So it starts with speech sound practice, and even though the children could say these sounds at the outset, we would practice, give them extra practice with some masked practice in an imitation format. Then we give them a chance to practice saying the words in a joint book reading context. We make up the books. They have scintillating, no, not really, storylines, but it doesn't seem to matter too much to the kids. And then we have an interactive routine that incorporates AAC, an iPad with the symbols and Prolo code to go, and encourage we provide input in AAC and, of course, the speech, and encourage the child to use both during the interactive routines, too. And then we also provide practice with receptive learning. We've actually had to substitute computerized instruction for tabletop, but the same idea where and we will ask them to find the bed, and so they're associating the picture with the spoken word in a receptive format. So all of this takes about 45 minutes, and it's the same word set, and we go through and try to see if we can help the kids to start producing these words. This is an example of the speech sound practice part of the intervention. So this little girl is practicing saying duh as in dad. And you'll notice that we also incorporate some components from prompt intervention, where we provide some physical prompts for kids that will tolerate this.
Dad. Dad. You say it. Dad. Oh, yay, Ariel, that was so good. Dad. Dad. That's what I like.
Okay, so of course I'm showing you some good examples here. So she did great. This is an example from one of the joint book reading activities. So we made up a book that's about Dot and Pen and Blue, I think, or Meat, all somehow in this story. And you'll see that he is doing pretty well in producing the words during the joint book reading task.
What's up, Blue? Dot. I heard you say dot. Oh, it's because I'm yes. Good job reading, Ethan. And look, Ethan, a red fan. Way to go, Ethan. High five. Good job, Ethan. And look, here's a blue pen. Pen, we can call her a princess. Look, Ethan, here comes Dad's cat. She's hungry. Let's feed her some meat. Way to go, Ethan. Nice job, Ethan. Good reading.
Kira is a very enthusiastic interventionist. Okay, so as I said, this trial is on pause. About half of the students completed the intervention, and hopefully we'll get back to the other half. But I can tell you at this point that, not surprisingly, some of the children are learning to say and select the word sets, so are kind of responding well, I would say, to the intervention, and others are not. And an important aspect of our research is try to identify characteristics of the kids who will respond compared to those who do not, because we don't want to waste precious intervention time for those who are not likely to respond. And I also want to acknowledge that this intervention reflects the developmental aspect of word learning, but not so much the functional. So the words are not selected to be highly functional for individual children or for classrooms, etc. I was really hoping to show an increase and a jump start into some spoken word production, and then incorporate considerations about functional word use. But I do believe the next iteration should have less pullout and more classroom-based functional words, while still trying to emphasize some of the speech sound production aspects. Okay, so even for the kids who don't show maybe progress or big gains in terms of their word productions, does that mean that they failed? Well, I don't think so. And if you think about it, seeking to help children learn symbolic communication when they really haven't done so in the last 5 years is a fairly daunting bar to set. So I mentioned that interventions have led to other improvements in communication. And for the last 10 years or so, I've my colleagues and I have focused on how to measure this progress better, and also current levels of communication following a developmental continuum. So with funding from one of the NIH measurement grants, Candace Fleming and I further developed the communication complexity scale for use with minimally verbal communicators. I say further because an early version of the scale was developed as part of the communication program project with colleagues Kathy Tiemann-Burke, Janet Marquis, Muriel Saunders from KU, and Leslie Alswang and Pat Dowden from University of Washington. And again, so the CCS is a 12-point scale that goes from basic alerting response up to 2-word phrases. So it's meant to tap into very early developmental stages. The co-PI on this grant, Candace Fleming and I, Candace Fleming leads our research design and analysis unit at KU. And so she is an excellent partner for a measurement grant. And with her help and her team and our team, we've demonstrated good inter-rater reliability for the CCS, moderate correlations with other measures like the communication matrix and the Vineland expressive subscale that are all based on caregiver report. And in combination or in partnership with Connie Casseri's team at UCLA, we showed that scores on the CCS changed over time for students in her intervention studies. Brenda Sally and I demonstrated that it's applicable to typically developing infants, and Kathy Tiemann-Burke and I applied the CCS during peer communication interactions. Now, with funding from IES, we are demonstrating that we can use the scale to describe communication in classroom contexts, not just in controlled interactions, and that educators can learn to use it. I'm working with several young investigators as part of their training grants, maybe some of them are listening, part of their F31s, to implement the CCS across populations and labs. And we're also providing additional training to teams of researchers around the world who recognize the need to measure pre-linguistic behaviors. CCS scores may be more sensitive to changes associated with an intervention than typical word-based measures, and therefore provide a more proximal idea if somebody is responding to an intervention. For example, we are using this as one of our predictors in the clinical trial that I just described. also developed a phonemic scoring system that's aimed to identify word approximations. So the same thing if somebody has not maybe mastered saying a word, but they're saying parts of the word, can we capture that score and again show some proximal gains earlier on? So in terms of future directions, we're also using the CCS in terms of identifying behaviors that are important for modeling communication development in order to identify who might remain minimally verbal. So postdoc Jenna McDaniel and I, along with colleagues at Georgia Tech University, recently submitted a proposal to use advanced computational modeling to determine children who are likely to remain minimally verbal from a young age, thus allowing individuals to initiate intervention at an earlier age and an earlier stage. So we're proposing to use the CCS and the phonemic scoring system to derive data for this model. I see other future directions as paralleling those of the field in terms of implementation science. So there still remains a huge gap between research and practice, and the next steps for the CCS needs to be focused on more efficient teaching to promote wider usage. Similarly, if the clinical trial has significant outcomes, then we need to investigate how to help clinicians, teachers, and caregivers implement the intervention and evaluate more widespread effects. This means identifying and tackling the barriers to implementation outside the confines of this research. For me, the focus will be on functional outcomes of interventions that reflect developmental theory with some considerations for phenotype. All right, so I have left time for questions and answers, and hope I'm gonna, oh, John's hopped on too, but I can go over to the Q&A section, but John, did you want to say something?
No, that's okay. If you can handle the Q&A, I wasn't sure if I should moderate it, but here's Hillary. So.
Hey, so anybody who has questions, if you don't want to get on live and share audio and video, you can ask them in the Q&A section. Otherwise, you can ask to share audio and video in the top right, and we'll kind of do like one at a time. And then we'll let you in, and Nancy will answer your questions.
I see one that I can jump right in on. Karen Chanowski. Hi, Karen. Asks, what are my feelings about using drill-based, it's kind of like, okay, about using drill-based interventions versus teaching them in a play-based context. Okay, first of all, Karen, I want to give a shout out to your phonemic scoring system, which we totally borrowed from in developing ours. So, Karen has a really interesting music-based intervention too, which I'm following developments and results from too. In terms of using drill-based interventions, I think they can be helpful for priming the behavior and getting them, if somebody doesn't, I use a lot of analogies for sports. So like, I'm a semi-intermediate tennis player. So sometimes I'll go out and practice my serves over and over and over, but it doesn't do any good till I'm actually in the game. But if I don't practice those serves, then my serves never get better in the game. So to me, I think both make sense, and actually, I think I got a lot of this information or thought process too in watching some of the early iterations of the Jasper interventions, and where Connie's team would also work on priming up some of those early communication behaviors at tabletop and then immediately take it to a play context. So I think combining them is probably the best approach. Okay, then I have another one. Can I talk a bit about how interventions to improve non-symbolic communication in the time of COVID and online communication? Yes, I don't know if I can talk about it, but I can whine about it. Just in terms of research, it's been extremely difficult to try to, pretty much all of my research has been paused. And so we have not really attempted to focus on the non-symbolic communication through virtual teaching, but a couple of my students have, because they've still got to finish their dissertation, so they have figured out some ways to use coaching, but that coaching with a third party. So either coaching parents to be the interventionist, or coaching, if the kids are in a classroom context, coaching that teacher to provide the intervention and kind of telling them what to do. So I think, that's the whiny side, but I would be curious to hear from some of the rest of you too. I think there are some unforeseen benefits, some lemonade out of lemons that we're seeing too, because if we can figure out how to do some of these interventions more effectively through virtual means, then we can have a much wider effect. We work in the schools in the greater Kansas City and Lawrence and Topeka areas, but if we were able to work with families in a much wider geographical area through virtual means, then we could obviously have more diversity, more participants, and be able to make some better determinations about effectiveness of different interventions.
Nancy, since there are no other questions sitting right there, I'd like to just kind of ask a quick one. I'm actually surprised to hear that the apparent difficulty of children with IDD in making a connection between symbols and either objects, because that's one of the things, when I teach sort of normative development, that's one of almost a given in reading and in language. Do you have, and I know you're that you're an applied scientist, but in terms of the basic science, do you have any sense of what the nature of that difficulty might be in association or mapping?
Well, that's a really good question, and that's sort of what I glossed over with one little slide. And we've tried a lot of different ways to kind of figure out, and we used a lot of behavioral interventions and looked at some like delayed matching to sample, and tried to see if we could help bridge that association. And other individuals have done very systematic approaches where starting with associations between real objects, and then trying to make a representation that is smaller but still a real object. And then actually people have even used some of the 3D printers to try to get the representation to gradually look more abstract. But it seems like it gets to a point where it doesn't look real enough anymore, and it just becomes difficult for some students. You don't have to go through these so many specific approaches, but I seem to gravitate to and find the students that really struggle with that transition. And I think it's really important, and something that we kind of just gloss over, because as you pointed out, for most kids, they just learn this. It's like, oh yeah, and then they have it. And I have I've been watching my granddaughter too, and she did it too. It's like she just kind of picked it up, and that arbitrary relationship is demonstrated pretty flawlessly so I think that's a big challenge, trying to figure out why it doesn't, and then helping to bridge that. But at the same time, saying that communicating with all these non-symbolic ways is still really important, and we need to keep that as a robust means of communication too.
Thanks, Nancy. I see there's another question. Go ahead and grab that.
Yeah. How many 45-minute sessions do they receive weekly, and how long is the intervention? So you're talking about the word learning intervention, that paused trial. So it's a smart design, and they get initially randomized to get 3 days a 5-minute sessions, and then after a period of time, I think it's 4 weeks, they get re-randomized to either having 5 days a week or the same intensity. So it's either 3 or 5 days a week for 45 minutes, and then the intervention is 2 months. So we're trying to kind of get them in and out to see if, again, it does this combined approach, which some of my colleagues have called like the kitchen sink approach, because I tried to put in everything that I thought would make a difference. Does that actually help get them off of baseline? So we tried to make that determination in a relatively short period of time. Another question, some children learn to use symbolic communication with poor pre-symbolic skills. What are your thoughts on children who learn to talk or sign with poor gesture use or joint attention skills? So that is an excellent question. And so all of these pre-linguistic skills are facilitative. It's what most typically developing kids go through, what we see also in the individuals who I study for the most part. But obviously, blind individuals learn to communicate well without having that joint visual attention. So I think it's an excellent question. What are some underlying processes that that enable children who maybe can't physically gesture or can't see and use that joint attention, joint visual attention? So what are some similar underlying processes? And I don't know, and I don't think we know, but other than to say that there's something else going on. And I think that some of the, more sophisticated computer brain interface measures may lead to some additional information on that. And I see a follow-up from Angela. We see these issues on most of our participants with Williams syndrome. Williams syndrome is another excellent example of kids who seem to skip stages, and and we hear about this for other kids too. But Williams syndrome is a better example. But some kids will say, they just started talking one day. Usually, if you're able to, not Williams syndrome, but usually if you're able to carefully document what goes on before they just start talking one day, you will find that they are using some of these pre-symbolic communication skills. But in the case of Williams syndrome or blindness or some other severe physical impairment, there are other mechanisms to get from pre-symbolic to symbolic. Hi, Angela. Angela worked with us in our lab too.
Well, as there are no more questions coming through, we're pretty close to time. About 10:24 here is what I have. I want to thank Nancy for her talk today. It's been great to, although we work together a lot, I hardly ever get to see her present her research, and it's been a great opportunity for me, and I hope it's been great for everyone else. We have at 10:40, I believe, 3 stages opening up for symposia. And so I would encourage everyone to take a quick break, and we'll all meet up at that time. Nancy, thank you so much for your talk, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the conference.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.